Please welcome Jason Shepherd, Senior Director for Strategy for Thomson Reuters Special Services International.
Good afternoon. Before I start, my team have asked me to pass on a message to everyone here to say thank you for the opportunity to be part of this fantastic community and for the chance to play our own small part in pursuing media freedom, inclusive economies and human rights. This is the work they signed up for. We all feel the privilege of being here with you. Xinjiang is a province in China. It covers around 1.6 million square kilometers and is home to about 25 million people. That's the population of Australia in an area about the size of Europe. About half of these people are Uyghurs, a minority in China and largely Muslim by faith. There's a growing consensus that since around 2014, the Chinese authorities have conducted a concerted campaign against the Uyghur population in Xinjiang, nominally aimed at suppressing independence movements that the Chinese assert are terrorist organizations, but which includes efforts to forcibly convert people's religions and to suppress their culture. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 1 and 2.5 million people are said to have been incarcerated in around 400 re-education camps. One, and only one, of the very serious allegations made about these camps is that they provide forced labor for local businesses. These dots represent places where we found recorded in references to forced labor mapped onto the geography. These are either re-education facilities or their businesses confirmed to be using forced labor. And today I want to focus on that specific charge that people are being forced to work and sadly leave aside the wider humanitarian crisis of the suffering, broken families and shattered communities that result from this policy, as we have just heard so powerfully. In an attempt to bear down on this use of forced labor and make these companies choose to disengage from the central policies of suppression against the Uyghurs, as well as to signal diplomatic disapproval and impact Chinese policies in the round, several countries have chosen to sanction or block goods coming in from the region. The legal frameworks they used to do so go back a very long way. The US Tariff Act dates back to 1930. The UK's Foreign-Made Prison Goods Act dates back to 1897. This is not a new concern. But the biggest market and the biggest player in this sanctions regime is the US. And this summer, they took a very big step expanding their sanctions regime at the same time as a major UN report from the Uyghur crisis was published. I strongly recommend reading both the US strategy and the UN report. There's also a legal case being brought in the UK that concluded yesterday against the government for not exercising its own legal mechanisms effectively. We'll hear the results of that soon. Article 1307, Title 19 of the US Tariff Act, bans goods produced by forced or penal labor from being imported into the US. And up till now, this has been implemented by Customs and Border Protection using specific withhold release orders, or WROs, for particular companies. In June this year, that US framework was updated by the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which introduced a rebuttable presumption that any goods coming from Xinjiang or from a list of specified companies have involved forced labor. Those goods will be seized until the importer can prove that they have been produced without forced labor. This is just one of a number of measures that the US is taking at the moment with respect to trade with China. It's also bearing down hard on technology transfer and attempting to constrain the Chinese semiconductor industry. So it's part of a wider picture. Now, the sectors most likely to be involved in forced labor are well known. The US government has called them out. Textiles, based on local cotton, foods, especially tomatoes, and polysilicon, essential for solar panels. These are all major exports from Xinjiang. And furthermore, the US government knows that there have been explicit attempts to evade sanctions and get these goods through to US markets. What's changing is the priority that's being given to this particular regime, this trade regime, and how important it is for companies trading with the US to know that their supply chain is clean. TRSSI, my organization, specializes in network analysis of entity resolved graphs to develop risk intelligence. What that means is we look at different data sets drawn from our own colleagues in the TR enterprise, from public sources, and from commercial partners, and we work out who's who in each data set. We connect people through their relationships within each of these data sets. We'll look at where someone is, who they're in business with, what's in the news, and so forth. And this lets us pull together pretty complete pictures around things that are otherwise hidden away. Now, the data's not perfect. It's not clean, it's not complete, but it is very, very informative when you can combine it together. And thankfully, it means that we can work to do our jobs without having to expose ourselves in the way that we've just heard. We've applied this methodology to this regime to see how visible these supply chains are to us, to see what evidence we can see of goods moving around, and to come to some form of assessment about the likely impact of attempting to bear down on this trade. On three conclusions that I think we've come to. The first is that we think it's possible to help companies identify where they're connecting with Xinjiang. It is in the data. You can't really say that you don't know. If you don't know, it's because you haven't looked. The second is that we can see, even now, evidence of goods circumventing this regime and getting into markets where they shouldn't be. This is good news. If it's visible, it means we can do something about it. And there are approaches that are available to help both the compliance regime, operators, and the companies manage the movement of these goods. And the third is that we didn't just look at the movement of goods, but we looked at financing. And what we found there was slightly surprising and maybe significant in the future. I'll come on to that in a moment. First, let's look at the key change that's changing this year, the rebuttable presumption that any company based in the province is using forced labor. This regime shifts the investigative burden onto the importer. It may well be intended to save Customs and Border Protection a lot of work. That will depend on how the importers approach the problem and how many applications for rebuttal against that presumption they actually make. But what it will definitely do is create an extra challenge for the importer, who has to ensure that it's checked all of the companies in its supply chain against not only a list of entities, but against their location. This is a new level of supply chain situational awareness for many companies. And in terms of effect, it moves the impact of sanctions from trying to put pressure on single companies onto putting pressure onto the whole region. It really does raise the stakes. So how many companies are we talking about? And how are both importers and Customs and Border Protection going to know where they are? It's pretty challenging. Unless, just to show off a little bit, you've got some tools like ours, where we can pull up a map of any area in the world, geobox it, and highlight all the companies who map into that location. Some of these companies are pretty high risk of involving forced labor because they're actually co-located with the re-education facilities. They are literally on site. Others are not too far away. We know from both US research and UN reporting that people are bussed around to different places to take them to their place of work. There are a lot. I was planning on putting up some detailed maps, but there's so many. This is actually a heat map showing the location of corporate locations overlaid with those no bad places from earlier. You can look at a place, you can see who's working there, you can look at a company and see where they are, and you can do it quickly. There really isn't an excuse not to do it. While this might not give you strong evidence to help in a rebuttal, it is certainly laying a case for the presumption and is something that should be used effectively. Second then, we wanted to check if we could see those supply chains that have been mentioned in the US strategy in the data that's available to us. There are three mentioned explicitly: cotton, tomatoes, and polysilicon. Let's start with cotton. Now, this has been the subject of withhold release orders since at least 2019. It's been a well-studied sector. It's a massive market. It really matters. I can't help but notice that everybody here is actually dressed. Good thing. In that market, quality and price matter. And Xinjiang cotton is historically very high quality. And until the ban, many companies made a big point about telling you that it was a differentiator of quality. However, some of these producers were themselves identified by CBP in the US as having used forced labor, and now no one's supposed to import any cotton from Xinjiang on the presumption that forced labor has been involved. But clothes are more complicated than they might seem. Not only are there several materials involved, but there are multiple processing steps and intermediate products to get moved around. These companies are all part of one corporate structure that's involved in the clothing trade, and as you can see, it includes companies outside China, and it's this sort of relationship the rebuttable presumption is aimed at. And what we can see in the data confirms that as of summer this year, Xinjiang cotton is still making its way into Western clothes. It seems that European polyester makes its way to Vietnam, where it's combined with Chinese cotton to make Vietnamese clothes that are sold under brand labels around the world. The cotton is laundered into the international market. The final importer, who's liable under the sanctions regime, has to really delve into their supplier relationships to identify where the subcomponents of their product has come from. That's what this whole regime is aimed at getting at. And as we found when we looked at this case, this actually gets harder when one of the corporate responses to a change in regime is to withhold information from the data around trade in an attempt to disguise the fact that this is cotton. Similarly, when we look at tomatoes, we can find commercial relationships and shipping data that shows commingling of product is still going on. Laying this over the map makes it pretty clear. There's a point where produce from multiple companies, including China, including from Xinjiang, comes together, is combined into a new product. These are tinned tomatoes. And the combination and tinning happens in Italy, so it's a made-in-Italy product, and the product gets into the EU and the US as an Italian product. So again, if you're importing products, you need to dig into the data to see what's really being provided to you. And it's not going to be surprising when we look to find that big supply chains with a lot of production capacity are going to find it easier to relabel their product than to retool their business and resource their suppliers. So getting to the point where these products don't come through the supply chain is going to take time. And it's going to take a few cases going public to explain to people what they need to do. So change of direction here. Let's not look only at the movement of products into the supply chain, but the other thing that we can see in the data, and that's of corporate ownership and financing. Money flows two ways here. Firstly, we can see shares in these companies being traded, which represents finance going into them. And secondly, as well as goods and services, company profits, a return on investment for the shareholders, are coming out. So the company benefits from investment, their owners benefit from business success is built upon forced labor. Foreign ownership and investment is not subject to these new regimes, these new trade regimes. This is important. It's not banned. This is not illegal. However, whilst it involves investment from outside China into the companies, the returns do represent an import of money back into the investing country. So it may well be at odds with the spirit of the strategy that's currently being set out. What gives this a further twist from an ESG perspective or from a climate perspective is what these people are investing in. China has a huge stake in renewable energy. We've heard this morning how important that is. The Chinese lead the world in processing crucial raw materials and in research and development in photovoltaics and wind generation. If we want to go green, and we seriously do, then we are going to be trading with China. Here's an example. Corporate ownership is famously labyrinthine, but it is possible to track ownership for publicly traded companies, and this is a company involved in photovoltaics and polysilicon, and you can see its investors. Most of them are in China. There's some sovereign wealth funds, and over here, 2 institutional investors in the US. And this is a company that's already on the WRO list. One more example. Here's another corporate structure. This enterprise is involved in making wind turbines. The parent company in Xinjiang doesn't just own other companies in the region, it owns companies all over China and all over the world, including America, Europe, and Australia. I seem to have let Australia off with being green. Can't think why. These companies, though, are traded on local stock exchanges and so are open for investment. That investment benefits the company based in Xinjiang. And we've also seen Western investment companies listed in the West that actually own entities in Xinjiang. And the numbers involved here are pretty significant. Rightly so, given the importance of renewable energy to all our children, but significant in terms of facilitating and enabling this avoiding of a just transition. So our drive for ESG investing in green energy will still bump into ESG choices about the companies that receive that money. To stress, this is not in contravention of the Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act nor the Tariff Act. It's not just these specific cases either. The finance markets are full of examples. This is systemic. We just wanted to flag that we can see the investment going on. It's extensive. Many, many investors are involved. It's a challenge for ESG investing in the round. But again, there is data that can help. So what conclusions can we draw from this short study? Well, firstly, that supply chain and finance complexity make tracking exposure to sanctioned entities difficult. But we think we've demonstrated connections can and will be found. We aren't the only people that can do this. Others might find it more challenging, but they will be looking. The data is there, at least enough of it to paint a clear picture. So we really don't have an excuse not to be using that information to inform decisions. Secondly, these challenges are in areas that Western investors and consumers really care about, like renewable energy. Now, it's important here that we don't see this as a choice between green transition and forced labour. There is a choice on neither front. We have no choice but to pursue a green transition, and I don't believe we have a choice to pursue anything other than a just transition. The choice we have is how we go about making those two things true at the same time. But what does this mean then for these trade regimes as a way to bear down on forced labour? Does this difficulty and complexity and avoidance of looking in the data and the massive challenges and choices that are in front of us, does this mean they don't work? Well, we study sanctions in a number of contexts, and so we're in a position to offer a point of view, and it's not negative. I'd highlight three things that make me optimistic that this is actually going to make a difference to people there. Firstly, the impact of sanctions is not just in the constraint on trade. It's in the message that it sends that you care. With Europe assembling its own regime being discussed at the moment, the legal case being heard today, and both of those are essentially discussing the principles behind rebuttable presumption, we're beginning to see a coalition of opinion coming together, which is going to have a significant bearing on trade liquidity in these goods. This is a clear signal that this is not a policy the wider world can tolerate. That's a good thing. The second thing is, this isn't just in the hands of industry and in the hands of the finance sector. This is an area where we all have a part to play. I noted we're all wearing clothes. We ought to choose where we buy them. We all eat food. We all get to choose where we shop. And we all benefit from capital investment, and some of us do get to make choices about where that capital goes. This power really matters. As an example, I'd look at Moscow just this spring, where many premium brands withdrew in protest over the invasion. This is the bizarre, inchoate and unstoppable power of liberal consumers. These companies weighed the likely loss of trade in Moscow against the desires of their customer base and did what many of us see as the right thing. Informed consumers are a powerful force. Key, as we've heard today, is to inform them. And finally, we know that the profile being given to this issue is having an effect on the Chinese government, who are taking steps to change the situation. Whether changing the facts on the ground or our understanding of them is emerging, but something is beginning to gain traction. Now, our small study was conducted very quickly, and we know we've only scratched the surface, but we think we've shown that it is possible to connect different data sources and pull threads out of the complex web of commercial relationships that lead back into Xinjiang, and in so doing show how connected we all are to those who remain trapped in forced labour and modern slavery. And I can hope we can add in a small way to the ability to bring pressure to bear, to the weight of moral argument, and perhaps bring forward the day when this kind of abuse is consigned, as it should be, to history. Thank you very much.